Assistant and Associate Professor in Philosophy of Education and American Indian Studies here at the Indigenous Studies Program at Cornell. Coming to you from the Sigourney and Tuscarora peoples, what is now Virginia, North Carolina. For those of you who are coming to American Indian Studies for the first time, welcome. It's really nice to have you. We want to and always acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of the Cayuga people. And it's a real pleasure for us to also have, as part of our community and staff, leadership of the Cayuga Nation, Carl Hill. And I'd like to express my thanks to Carl and Kathy Halbig and Justin Mansfield for helping provide all of the structure and elements that make this seminar possible. Also like to acknowledge the director of the American Indian Program, Jillian Rickard, for her ongoing support of so much of the programming that we've been able to provide. I think a really robust set of programming under her tenure, rather. This seminar today is we're hosting Professor Nxumalo, who is coming from Swaziland via Toronto and British Columbia, and now located at Austin, Texas. She is an assistant professor in early childhood education at the University of Texas at Austin. For those of you who have read a little bit about her work, she's working at the intersection of early childhood education, but in the context of environmental education, I think broadly understood in early childhood and environmental education, and settler colonial entanglements. So please help me welcome Professor Nxumalo to the American Indian Program here at Cornell.
Hi everyone, thank you. Thank you, Ula, and everyone that's made it possible for me to be here today. I'm really thankful to be here with you all, thinking together on the territory of the Cayuga peoples. I also want to acknowledge that land acknowledgement is only one very small part of the vast and necessary work of being accountable to and continuously working to undo settler colonialism. I also want to acknowledge that the work that I'll be discussing today has emerged from working within the very specific context of the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Coquitlam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples in what's now called British Columbia, Canada, where I've lived and worked and studied for half of my lifetime. So that's primarily the place from which I'll be speaking today, although I'm hopeful that what's emerged from this very situated work will have resonances to other places and spaces of early childhood education. So in this talk, I'm going to briefly situate my orientation towards the Anthropocene and then connect this orientation to early childhood education and what I see as the need for decolonizing approaches that unsettle both anti-Blackness and settler colonialism. I'll then discuss some of the propositions that I'm currently thinking with in bringing the Anthropocene into conversation with environmental and place-based early childhood education. So the naming of the Anthropocene as the current epoch of human-caused environmental precarity has brought needed attention to the ways in which humans have transformed the Earth's ecosystems. However, the Anthropocene brings both potential and pitfalls in generating responses to current planetary environmental challenges. There is, for instance, potential, albeit ever more elusive in the current political climate, potential in underlining the current, the uncertain futures and entangled precarities on a planetary scale, and thereby harnessing collaborative and collective action. However, an important pitfall of the universalizing planetary discourse of the Anthropocene and its activation of what Vanessa Argott-Jones calls ideas about the human that universalize rather than particularize is the persistence of narratives that do not take into account the foundational impacts of slavery and genocidal settler colonial violence in precipitating the Anthropocene and the ways in which climate change is an intensification of colonially induced environmental changes such as those precipitated by plantation ecologies and extractive capitalism. So the erasure of the foundational and ongoing colonial and enslavement violences of the Anthropocene is often accompanied by an erasure of stratified vulnerabilities to human-caused environmental degradation, as seen in many examples of the colonial, race, and class impacts of the Anthropocene. So, put another way, engagements with the Anthropocene as an era of human-caused environmental precarity, while important and urgent, often reiterate whiteness and privilege, in largely ignoring the fact that while we are in this environmental mess together, there is no universal we in relation to who and what has suffered, currently suffers, and will suffer the most, whose knowledges count the most, what ways of relating to and responding to living with the Anthropocene are made visible, and who gets to learn in complex and situated ways with and about the environment. So what does this all have to do with early childhood education, and why do insights and concerns about the Anthropocene matter for early childhood education? Perhaps one place to begin making some connections is with a short story summarized from a recent event. So South Park Family School is located in what is now called Victoria, British Columbia. For the second year in a row, the school's nature kindergarten admission process is a greatly anticipated social event. Program enrollment was scheduled to open on a Monday morning, but families started lining up the Friday before in hopes of securing one of the 20 spots available. People pitched tents, brought provisions, and the local press reported a festive atmosphere over the wet, cold, and 3-day wait for registration to begin. So this story of frenzied registration efforts, long wait lists, and campouts to secure a spot is a pretty common story in North America, where there has been a marked proliferation in nature-based early childhood programs, such as the ever-popular forest preschools, kindergartens, garden schools, and other ecocentric curricular options from which predominantly urban families can choose. While educational attention to children and the environment is welcomed, there are several troubling aspects of many of these programs, perhaps illustrated by the image that I have up here that shows what comes up from searching children and nature. So clearly this coupling of children and nature refers to certain visions of perfect children that need to be returned to perfect visions of pure natures, a marked dissonance with the environmental damage and precarity that marks the Anthropocene, as Africa Taylor has noted. So early childhood then is a space where the often raced and settler colonial erasures of the Anthropocene discourses are often, even if inadvertently, reinforced. While ironically the realities of the impacts of the Anthropocene are also largely ignored. The overwhelming economic privilege and whiteness of most nature-based early childhood programs is also troubling, especially since structural inequality in relation to the environment is rarely taken up. So I'm particularly concerned with the ways in which environmental education for young children rarely brings attention to Indigenous and Black land relations. An example is found in the ways in which nature kindergartens and preschool remain inaccessible for many children of color. School gardens for young children of color, especially Black children in urban schools, are also often positioned from deficit perspectives as a way to bring nature to certain children who are seen as at risk or lacking normal connections with nature, perpetuating what Catherine McKittrick calls Black narratives of unbelonging. At the same time, the inclusion of Black children into nature education, such as the popular forest schools, when it does occur, also assimilates them into the settler colonial nation-building project, where the pure nature that I mentioned earlier awaits their learning and discoveries, reenacting colonialism's terra nullius through love for Canada's empty wilderness. Settler colonialism then is perpetuated through the persistent erasure of Indigenous land and life in settler children's pedagogical encounters with outdoor places, alongside persistent, idealized, romanticized, and human-centered couplings between children and nature. As I suggested earlier, with the idealization of nature as perfect natures in both indoor and outdoor early childhood education contexts, pedagogical and curricular engagements with anthropogenically damaged landscapes are also largely absent. For example, as maybe some of you know, it's not uncommon, regardless of children's particular geographies and particular experiences of climate change, for weather in early childhood classrooms to be studied through predetermined science plans, usually organized around learning the seasons and identifying the weather of the day. This is typically accompanied by predetermined craft activities such as fall leaves, winter snow, summer sun, spring flowers, and so on. Clearly then, there is a need for less human-centered and more contextual, relational, as well as socio-politically and ethically attuned approaches to environmental education with young children. And despite recent work towards more ethically and politically oriented modes of engagement with the Anthropocene, there remains a gap in terms of early childhood curriculum, pedagogy, and research that critically engages with the Anthropocene, including its entanglements with settler colonialism and anti-Blackness. And while there are many entry points towards critically and generatively engaging with current times of environmental precarity in early childhood, for the remainder of the talk, I want to specifically attend to some possibilities that I've been thinking with for centering Black and Indigenous life in early childhood environmental and place-based education. In particular, I think with Indigenous feminist theories or ways of knowing and relating in relation to presencing and relating, Black and Black feminist theories of testifying witnessing. In doing this, I'm interested in bringing forward some possibilities for the kinds of ethnopolitical orientations and materialized possibilities for the that are needed to create different kinds of relations in environmental education for young children. In other words, I'm interested in educational possibilities that resist deficit constructions of Black nature relationships, that resist erasures of Indigenous land and life, and that resist assimilation of Black and other racialized young children into the settler colonial project. My suggestion is that there is a need for educational places and spaces where children's relations with the natural world are affirmed without a reliance on the always already racialized trope of romantic childhood innocence that dominates child nature discourses, although this purview of innocence is not available to all children, and where Black and Indigenous land relationships and knowledges are affirmed without ignoring the structural violences of ongoing Indigenous land dispossession and environmental racism, and where the environmental learning of Black and Indigenous children is not premised on inclusion, as I mentioned, perhaps mentioned, into so-called inclusive Eurocentric developmental trajectories that are reliant on locating deficits in individual children. So I frame the interruptions brought by thinking with specific Indigenous and Black onto epistemologies as propositional approaches that researchers and educators might consider in their work with young children. And my use of the word propositional is intentional. So rather than putting forward enclosed prescriptions to be followed, my intent is to provoke maybe different kinds of thinking in relational situated encounters with knowledges more than human relations, practices, places, and so on. So in considering ways to respond to the absenting of Indigenous life and land and more than human relations in most forms of environmental education with young children in settler colonial contexts, I've been inspired by Anishinaabe scholar Leanne Simpson's conceptualization of presencing as acts that foreground ongoing Indigenous presences, resurgence, and land relationships in multiple ways. Simpson calls for presencing as decolonial acts that counter the continual colonial mapping and erasing of Indigenous presence. And so inspired by the potentials of presencing, I've been using the concept refiguring presences to describe research and pedagogical practices in early childhood that intentionally seek ways to trouble the literal and figurative ghosting of Indigenous ways of knowing and being from place-based and environmental early childhood education. I see potential for refiguring presences as non-innocent knowledge-making practices that interrupt everyday colonialisms in environmental early childhood education. So what then might refiguring presences entail as pedagogical practices? One practice that I found useful in my research working in early childhood settings with predominantly white settler and racialized immigrant children has been to seek out place stories that unsettle the outdoor places that I encountered with children and educators as what Morton calls empty uninscribed land, both currently and in the past. So I'm referring here to place stories and place storing that, as I mentioned, affirm Indigenous land, life, and relations, while also foregrounding human and more than human relationalities. In other words, stories that recognize, as Zoe Todd says, that Indigenous land, life, and futures are deeply entangled and co-constitutive. And so while such stories are pedagogical, they're not premised on children's physical, socio-emotional development or the academic benefits that are derived from nature encounters, which is the dominant discourse in environmental ed for young children. Refiguring presences also requires intentional movement away from reinscribing the relegation of Indigenous peoples to a benign and ghostly past. Pedagogies inspired by presencing them, while having potential to disrupt early childhood environmental education as usual, are risky and implicated practices that necessarily include attention to colonial geographies as ongoing impacts on everyday life. So I'll briefly share an example that might give an idea of what it might mean to, for instance, present children's relations. In this particular example with cedar. So on our almost daily walks in the forest, the red cedar trees have become places to stop and linger with the children. The first tree, disintegrating and partially burnt, called charcoal tree by the children, often invites them to use broken pieces of charcoal to make marks on the exposed red-orange trunk of the tree. A practice one child calls and others echo, "We're giving the charcoal back to the tree." The second tree is an ancient hollowed-out red cedar tree stump that the children have named Bear House, imagined as a home for the black bears that share this forest with us. Initial reflections on these encounters by the teachers as they document children's learning include emergent literacies, such as children's understandings of the connections between burnt trees and the charcoal that we work with in the classroom, as well as caring relations between children in the forest. However, in beginning to think with a practice of refiguring presences, different questions, stories, and place pedagogies emerge. For instance, stories of the destruction by fire and overcutting of much of the old-growth red cedar trees in this particular forest during the colonial logging period emerge alongside place stories of the red cedar as kin to the Coast Salish peoples of this place. More recently, in collaboration with the Squamish Nation family whose child attends the childcare center, children have been visiting with Squamish artist Jody Brimfeld as he works on hand-carving a red cedar Squamish welcome figure from a 350-year-old red cedar log gifted by the Squamish Nation. This figure honors the territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Coquitlam. And over the course of close to 2 years now, the children have been learning with and encountering red cedar, living red cedar, and encountering also living red cedar kinship relations, and learning to sing the Coast Salish anthem, which they have been invited to sing with Jody Brimfeld at the raising and blessing of the figure close to the childcare center. Importantly here, presencing is not about the consumption of Indigenous knowledges and culture by non-Indigenous children, although I see this as always a risk. It's about children every day knowing and living this particular place as the present territory of the Coast Salish people, and as a place of living human and more than human Coast Salish knowledges. Presencing here then has included bringing to children both stories of settler colonial destruction of the red cedar, alongside stories of and encounters with living and present Coast Salish kin relations with the red cedar through these engagements. And as many others have said and written, Indigenous ways of knowing, relating, and living with more than human others have much to teach about learning to live in relational, interdependent, respectful, reparative, regenerative, and recuperative relations with more than human worlds in current times of environmental precarity, including ways of relating that unsettle persistent Western humanisms and universalisms that current environmental discourses reproduce. So one question I've been thinking with is what might taking inspiration from Indigenous relational ways of knowing and being that have never separated nature from culture or the human from the more than human look like in environmental early childhood education. And again, this is not to suggest that non-Indigenous people simply appropriate these ways of non-anthropocentric ways of relating, but that they consider possibilities for learning with and from Indigenous ways of relating to place and more than human worlds. Western science education, while important, alone is clearly not enough. So the argument here is that we need different modes of relating that foreground more ethical relations. One example of what these non-anthropocentric relational pedagogies might look like is it found in perhaps restoring the ways in which young children learn with and about water. moving away from typical pedagogies. So in early childhood classrooms, water is typically a resource for children's learning in relation to physical, sensory development, socio-emotional development, and cognitive development. So in reimagining water pedagogies, I'm inspired by Indigenous scholar Sandy Grande, who gives the example of the Defenders of the Water School at the Standing Rock Camp, which brought together curriculum that included Indigenous knowledges, histories of Black and Indigenous dispossession, and place-based math and science learning. This living relational curriculum making also included bearing witness to and learning from the actions of the water protectors, how to be in good relation with more than human others. So re-envisioning children's environmental pedagogical encounters in relational ways, staying with the example of water pedagogies, could also include, alongside the profoundly relational teachings of water is life embodied by the Standing Rock Camp, pedagogical encounters that also testify to anti-Blackness in ongoing issues such as the poisoning of Flint, Michigan's water supply. This story is told by lead leach water, Legionnaire's disease causing bacteria, by lead-poisoned bodies of Black children, by necropolitical governmental practices of neglect and abandonment, and by the ongoing accumulation of plastic water bottles. Importantly, just as Sandy Grande foreground stories of both settler colonial impacts on water relations and of Indigenous resistance, alongside attention to environmental anti-Blackness, re-envisioned relational water pedagogies could also include attention to Black resistance. For instance, the story of Marie Kopany, whose activism has become a symbol for the community's resistance and fight for clean water. As I stated earlier, Black childhoods and Black perspectives in both dominant North American Anthropocene discourses and in environmental education for young children are marked predominantly by absence and or by deficit salvation discourses, as well as misrepresentations of Black people as not caring about or as indifferent about nature. And I found Black feminist theories invaluable in making sense of the persistence of these discourses in schooling context and more broadly in society. This work in particular shows the insufficiency of understandings of human subjectivity that dominate Anthropocene discussions. So for instance, Zakiya Jackson's work has helped me to consider how disrupting the colonial human, non-human binary requires attention to those who were and continue to be excluded from belonging within the category of the human. Her work in complicating universalized understandings of the human helps to show how moves towards centering more than human worlds as a response to the Anthropocene, while it enacts some needed disruptions to Enlightenment humanism and its attendant human exceptionalism, often leaves unexamined differential human vulnerabilities and responsibility in anthropogenic places. So for example, in relation to how entanglements, as I mentioned earlier, of colonialism, slavery, and advanced capitalism continue to create deeply inequitable human effects. So in seeking ways to engage with possibilities for that what's perhaps a both-and orientation that interrupts human exceptionalism while also interrupting a universalized view of the human, I've turned to Black feminist theories and in particular to this practice of testifying witnessing as modes of resisting absence and deficit thinking with Black childhoods and education in the Anthropocene. So Tarpley is one Black feminist theorist that I've started to think with, and she articulates past-present histories of African American testifying and witnessing as bringing close attention to the embodied violences of anti-Blackness, alongside multiple acts of agency that exceed knowability within the damage-centered relations of slavery and what Christina Sharp describes as the ongoing wake of slavery. My underlying questions, and this is work that's still in process, that I'm still thinking with, are what are the potentials of practices of testifying witnessing for making a difference towards situated anti-racist place inquiry in early childhood education? What particular knowledge-making and interfering trajectories might be enacted through thinking with testifying witnessing? So brought to context of environmental and place-based early childhood education, perhaps testifying witnessing can be thought of as modes of revealing the inequitable differentiations of Black situatedness within anthropogenic inheritances, while simultaneously affirming Black humanity. Black life as an intrinsic part of the world, to quote Tarpley, gestures to an affirmation that refuses what I mentioned earlier in relation to what Catherine McCritchie terms assumptions of Black life as ungeographic. Black feminist practices of testifying witnessing can perhaps make visible the complexities of Black geographies beyond stories of damaged place relations, surveillance, and absence. Alongside Tarpley, Black feminist scholar Patricia Collins also points to this idea of a relationality of testifying as a practice that requires effective responses from witnesses and that is situated within particular events and encounters. So what might testifying as a proposition for changing environmental or place-based education look like in curriculum making or pedagogy with young children? So while I'm still thinking through this, currently I see this as an invitation for early childhood educators to seek out place-based pedagogies that might simultaneously witness place-based inequalities, while at the same time testify to seek out alternative, affirmative possibilities for Black children's relations to places. So this might include practices of documenting Black children's place encounters in ways that pay attention to not only the learning that is happening, but also to relationality and belonging. So returning to the example of my place-based work with children and educators in what is now Vancouver, British Columbia, Black histories and geographies are often absented in British Columbia. So in this particular place, the story of Hogan's Alley in Vancouver as a Black place that was destroyed is an important one to share with children, alongside stories of persistence and community in Black place relations despite this displacement. So then the question is, how might such stories be made visible in encounters with particular places with young children? What might emerge from seeking out Black land stories with children? I don't see this as easy or prescriptive work, especially in seeking out stories that are not only linked to oppression and displacement. So while the intent is not to ignore those stories, I propose that in addition to different kinds of pedagogies and curriculum, we also need different kinds of stories for young children, stories that unsettle deficit or absented depictions, stories that testify to and witness generative Black place relations and futurities. And I've recently, in thinking further about this, turned to speculative fiction as a source of inspiration that might be brought to early childhood education as creative and interruptive modes of testifying witnessing. And what I'm thinking with is how educators might draw inspiration from speculative fiction in seeking out and co-creating with children place-based and environmentally attuned literary representations that situate both Black and Indigenous childhoods and places, including nature, in ways that unsettle deficit or absented depictions. Ruha Benjamin, arguing for the importance of speculative fictions as testimony for generative Black futurities, underlines the interruptive effect of such stories in their potential to, and this is a quote, reimagine and rework all that is taken for granted about the current structure of the social world, and experiment with different scenarios, trajectories, and reversals, elaborating new values and testing different possibilities for creating more and just and equitable societies. Such fictions are not meant to convince others of what is, but to expand our own visions of what is possible. This is not to say that imagining alternatives is sufficient or that all things possible are even desirable, but how will we know if we do not routinely push the boundaries of our own thinking, which includes the stories that we tell about the social world? So unsettling depictions of certain childhoods, there are a number of these examples, and here I'm particularly drawing from Black speculative fiction, that could be restored for young children, and that bring forward otherwise Black land, nature, environment relations, such as in specific relational depictions of children in nature. And this might include representations that strategically draw on child-nature couplings that resist images of certain children as out of place in nature. And these strategic forms of representation might perhaps be seen as resistant and performative modes of what I'm referring to as testifying witnessing. Jackson describes such fictional interventions as enacting speculation as an intervention into and as theory, intensifying speculation's performance as theory and theory's performance by blackness. Put another way, while tropes of predominantly white innocent settler children in pure nature that I referred to earlier replicate colonial binaries, for black childhood such images from black speculative imaginaries can instead act in anti-racist ways. And my colleague, Dr. Kihana Ross, and I are currently trying out writing some speculative fiction that draws on some of the ideas that I've been discussing here to imagine some alternative educational futures that are focused on Black and Indigenous children's learning, including entangled Black Indigenous subjectivities, in ways that affirm their childhoods while also taking seriously the ways in which settler colonialism and anti-Blackness are always already imbricated in the asymmetrical impacts of environmental precarity. So while here I've presented just 3 propositions, these are of course not the only possibilities for resisting settler colonialism and anti-Blackness in environmental and place-based education with young children. And I also want to acknowledge that this is fraught and challenging work for educators. Even well-intentioned pedagogies risk reinforcing anthropocentrism, appropriation, and reification. But nonetheless, I think I see some potential for disruptions, however small, in taken for granted early childhood pedagogy as usual, which continues to dominate. And I see this as a source of potential in beginning to try out some of these ideas in early childhood education places. And that's all I have. That was a bit fast, sorry, I read.
Thank you so much. Yes. Questions?
I'm just so eager to respond. I just have to say, firstly, Wiso Nyawe, like super big thank you for this, because this is like music to my ears. About half the people in this room know me. I'm a graduate of here from the Natural Resource Department, environmental education. This is all like so much to my heart, what you've been talking about. And I just finished here 2 years ago. And it's nice to see, you know, where to begin. So just to give you a little onto a background, before I came to Cornell in 2000 as an undergrad, I worked very closely with the MOVE organization, and I count a lot of Black Panthers and members of the Black Liberation Army who are political prisoners as close personal friends. So then coming out of my work in my 20s on Leonard Peltier's case, and so then landing here in Ithaca in this 75% white town, graduating, getting a job with the university, teaching filmmaking. And that was good and all, but really saw the need for something for the kids of color in this town being needed, so they could tell their stories. And being a filmmaker, we started a program called Green Gorillas in 2006, and Kiri Ransom, sitting over there, was one of our first kids, and it was a few Native kids, mostly Afro-diasporan, one continental African, a young woman from Kenya was in the program, Asian American, you know, a nice little mix of the youth here in this community who told us, you know, this is what we did in our daily practice. And a lot of the people in the Northwest that you work with are people I have close and long, you know, over 2 decades relationships with as land defenders, as water protectors, as people who've been building as well solidarity between urban communities of color and rural indigenous communities. So, and to hear you talk about the water protectors movement and the school there, and you know the chief or you know the coordinator there, Steve is a good personal friend of mine, of course. And I was thinking as I was walking here, because I did my old routine as a grad student where I park out by Bell Sherman where it's free parking, and hiked, and it was very windy, and I was reflecting, because I know most of the people here probably were following Standing Rock last year on social media, and remember on November 20th or 21st when the police turned the water cannons on the water protectors, and the weather was like how it was today. So imagine today and getting shot at with and getting soaked. And all the hollering you hear on the quad, imagine that going on for hours, including police on booming microphones yelling at you, and and so, when sometimes these words like settler colonial, it like may seem a bit of an abstraction, and but the violence that the police mete out on black and brown bodies every day, whether in urban or rural areas, it's very real. So it was, when you said that, it was a very emotional moment for me too, because it just brought me back there, because I spent all of, last fall going back and forth from here, there bringing supplies. and after the first time I went there, and the frontline camp was overrun on October 27th by the police, I had to come back because I had a plane ticket already planned, and I couldn't sleep, and the first thing I knew I had to do was, my best friend in the world is an African brother named Jomo, who's an acupuncture doctor, and I said, I gotta get him and go back because he knows how to treat trauma, PTSD. He's also an EMT. He's also all kinds of holistic healer. And here at 3 a.m. in the morning that I can't sleep, and I'm rolling a cigarette, and I turn on my phone, and who texts me at 3 in the morning and says, "Are you up?" And so within a couple of days, me, him, and a Seneca lawyer, and my partner, who's a documentary photographer, went back out again to arrive back just in time for the battle for Turtle Island. People were standing in the river and getting tear gas. So I just wanted to thank you. I mean, the speculative fiction, though, Octavia Butler is my #1 author, so that, and futurisms, I'm a Luddite futurist. That was my background coming here to Cornell, and Troy will tell you, he's known me for 20 years. I could go outside and grab sticks off a tree and start a fire in this wind, and I can also build one of these Mac computers and rip them apart. And so we're at this very interesting time, and environmental education that's what I do, live and breathe, before I got my current day job for the last 2 years after graduation. So I'm so thankful. Troy was like, if you come to one thing this semester, you gotta come see this speaker. So thank you for coming here. Welcome to our lands and our territories. I hope your stay is enjoyable. I know if you're coming from Austin, that this cold is a bit of a shock.
Yes. Thank you so much.
I was just in Austin earlier this year, and it seemed different. So just thank you so much for this. This was, I haven't eaten breakfast yet. This was my breakfast. Thank you.
Thank you.
And maybe you could, just a question, and just instead of just giving a monologue, is, your slide 2 on Proposition 2, talking about affect and ethics, that's something that really resonated with me and what I spoke to in my dissertation. I was wondering if you could maybe go in a little deeper, because I think that's a very, that's what I believe is how much affect affects our sense of environmental ethics, and that's the connection point for people in a digital generation that you can create, is when, like, that's the work we did in Green Guerrillas, was using cameras to learn about environmental and social justice issues, but also to get out in nature and disrupt, and just for themselves to find their own relationship through the beauty of nature and the beauty of their digital media and effects and sounds and music that they can work with. So if you could speak to that, that would make me happy.
Yeah. I think it's really important, even in those small everyday encounters, like that children kind of learn to be affected by things. But I kind of struggle with thinking about pedagogically, what is that? How could we kind of bring out those kind of affects? And I think some of those stories that I mentioned in relation to like children learning about that tree, that bear house. It's not just the bear house, like it's something that was like killed as part of like the colonial logging process. Like that kind of generated affects with children. But thinking about how to, just in actual everyday encounters with things, without explaining in words, how to kind of bring out those affects is kind of a challenging thing to me to think about. But I think it's important to think about affect pedagogically, but I think I'm still struggling to think about what does it mean to kind of enact children to learn to be effective.
And if I might add, what are the ages of the
So these are
people?
preschool children, so 3 to like 5.5 years old.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. It got me going too, as my neighbor here did. My name's Alan Hyman, and I'm not an academic. I'm an IT guy. I run computer labs and 150 printers across campus. But I'm also involved in improving schools throughout sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in Zambia, where I used to live. And at this point, we're building a high school, which is a Zambian project that I'm part of, in improving all the elementary schools. So I go there regularly, and I'm in the very deep bush in the southern province. And the books, which we largely buy, because the government of Zambia doesn't supply books, we buy them for all the elementary schools, are very Western based. And there's very little about, until recently, there's very little about actual Zambia in these books. They're slowly introducing books in the major languages in the country. So that's been something I've been experiencing strongly. And along with what you're saying, I wonder if this has occurred to you, because it was a shock to me. I love the bush in Zambia. I spent a great deal of time in the game parks in Zambia, Kenya, Tanzania, Malawi. And I was shocked to find out that they're all very artificial. That the Mopani forests that exist today only are about 100 years old, because as many people here probably know, when the Italians invaded Ethiopia, they brought cattle loaded with foot-and-mouth disease. And that decimated Africa, destroyed the cultures all over the continent. And then in the modern day, mostly Europeans who set up the game parks drew these lines around these places, much like things happen here, and said, okay, so this is Lolangwa, Kruger, whatever it is. Look at this pristine beauty, which it's not. It's an abstract, and it's artificial. But here today, America, people will say, I'm going on safari, I'm going back to the bush. No, you're not. You're going to this thing that was created because of a disaster. But the selling of that to Western culture, to everybody, is that this is something we can all go and experience as primal nature. It's not. So I just wonder, I know exactly what you're talking about, in terms of, look at the child in the beautiful, perfect wilderness, when in Africa and in North America, and I don't know anyone else I can say this about, people didn't live separate from the animals. They lived with the animals, and they lived in the environments. And I don't know how you break that down. I don't know how that is explained, because the fundamental understanding is wrong. These things are somehow captured bits of, perfect wilderness. I don't know if this has come up in your studies or not.
Yeah, I mean, there's I think a fair amount of work in relation to how colonial the idea of the wilderness is, and how pervasive it still is. Like even in the context of the place where I worked with the children on Burnaby Mountain, like that area is, so it's a conservation area. And so it's so-called protected land, but it's been created literally by the removal of indigenous people. But for the people that live there, it's this place to kind of experience pure nature. When actually the forest is actually now a second growth forest, mostly because those cedars were destroyed as part of the colonial logging project. And there definitely are resonances with those constructions of the wilderness in African contexts as well. And I can't remember what they put in terms of shifting that perspective. Well, that one of the things that I was talking about in relation to the idea of thinking with relationality, and that I think has generative potential in terms of unsettling that nature-culture binary, because there are many global indigenous perspectives that have never had that kind of binary view of nature and culture. But in terms of the actual enacting of shifting and unsettling that, I think it's really hard work to do. But I think there are these moments, and I think children in some ways already have these ways of, I don't think it was in what I presented today, but these moments where children have have an example like in Encounters with Rocks, and how they were talking about how the rocks were alive and they were lively, and already like have this ability. They haven't like necessarily been taught to kind of make these separations between what's alive and what's not. And so I think children already in some ways enact some of these disruptions that as adults, you know, we are not so great at in terms of disrupting that nature culture environment. But yes, wilderness as a colonial construct is really pervasive. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think it is part of, in the Canadian context, I think it's part of like the nation building project, right? And even if it's not intentional, I think, and I'm not saying that I'm outside of that, I think I'm really like implicated in that as someone who worked for a long time as an educator in a so-called forest school, but have recently been thinking about how those forest schools are actually part of like perpetuating and enforcing that nation building project, like teaching children love of the empty wilderness, but not as Indigenous land, as like, you know, this image of Canada as, you know, this place of natural, pure nature, which, in contrast to actually a lot of the destructive things that are happening within the Canadian mining and all kinds of projects.
Again, thank you. I think I'm very proud to continue this direction. So I went to a Waldorf school, and
A Waldorf?
yes,
Oh,
and you know I'm forever grateful for that. But it's very interesting now to look at it from a different perspective and to see how, you know, some of the pedagogies, however well-meaning, probably are enforcing some of these binaries and kind of traps that are existing for us to fall into. So I'm curious a little bit more about some of the practices that you found to be really inspiring or effective. So we've heard about storytelling, and I'm just curious, like, how are some of the ways that teachers can facilitate, or teachers, that caregivers and caretakers can facilitate these kinds of growth? And I understand it's very situational, but just I'm curious your thoughts on what you've seen as the most exciting.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think many of the things that have emerged that I have found to be really generative have not necessarily been like intentional kind of pedagogical things. Like in another piece I wrote about the protests that were happening on the mountain in relation to, like, there's a proposal right now to like drill through the mountain to expand a pipeline, and how like me kind of giving a prompt to educators to think about what was happening on the mountain in relation to that, and how it could or could not be a part of children's curriculum, even though I would say that it didn't necessarily like fully achieve in terms of what I was thinking in terms of bringing that into children's curriculum, was something that was in some ways generative in terms of disrupting that really pervasive like bubble of protection of children. Yeah, it's hard to think in terms of like intentional, like pedagogical practices. I think one of the things is, like I mentioned, how sometimes children already have these ways of doing that are not so human-centric, and often the kind of immediate response with educators is like to correct or like to give the right answer. So like, for instance, with the idea around children and rocks, so how could that be like a generative conversation to think about, what's alive and what's not, rather than saying, rocks are not alive. How could we engage in relation to like the water example. So encounters with children with water, how could that be taken up in a way that's not this like learning about water? So I think often like children would say things like, even in relation to water, that kind of gesture to already thinking with the liveliness of water. So what are the ways that educators might kind of like take that up instead of kind of shutting it down or wanting to give the correct information. That's one thing I can think of. But in terms of like the Waldorf, I think like there's a long like history of that whole discourse, like going back to Rousseau and Froebel around childhood innocence. I think is really like hard to shift, and it's interesting to think how long that has persisted in terms of like the innocent child. But I think there are some great things about Waldorf, especially within like the current school environment and like the focus on testing and all of that. So I think there are some things that are great about Waldorf.
Could I ask just one more thing?
Yes.
Because in reading one of your papers, there was, I can't remember which one it was, that you mentioned a little bit about education, about pipelines, and some of these more tricky, well, you know, frankly negative concepts to have to learn, you know. So how have you reconciled these ideas of, you know, allowing children to have childhood, right, and to not be burdened by the weight of, you know, these issues that all of us are, you know, struggling with, so that, you know, there is some sort of youthfulness, but also not glossing over these political and social injustices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think, at least in the context that I worked in, most of like what happened pedagogically in curricula was not around like serious issues like pipelines. It was a project-based curriculum, and the projects ranged from many different things, like engagements with, I don't know, thinking with clay, or lots of arts-based kinds of inquiries with children. So I would say that the majority of like the pedagogical encounters were not necessarily in relation to, so when we were out in the forest, the children were really interested in mushrooms, so there was like a mushroom inquiry, for instance. So I would say I don't really worry about that. I think it's